The late afternoon sun dipped low over the sleepy town of Willow Creek, casting golden streaks across the cracked pavement outside Ethan Brooks' modest garage. The air was thick with the scent of oil and rust, a familiar comfort to Ethan, who had spent his entire life fixing things, cars, bikes, dreams that others had long given up on. But today, something far beyond his understanding was about to unfold, something that would unravel the very fabric of his quiet existence. A deep, guttural roar tore through the sky, startling Ethan as he wiped grease from his hands onto his faded overalls. He squinted upward, shielding his eyes against the glare, and froze. A sleek private jet, its silver body gleaming like a predator in the sunlight, descended with unnerving precision toward the town's tiny airstrip, a strip usually reserved for crop dusters and the occasional medical evacuation. This was no ordinary visitor. This was something else entirely. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest as the jet's wheels kissed the ground, sending up a cloud of dust that danced in the fading light. He stood rooted to the spot, his calloused hands trembling for reasons he couldn't name. A black car, its tinted windows reflecting the world like a dark mirror, pulled up beside the jet with a smooth, deliberate grace. The door of the jet opened, and a set of polished metal stairs unfolded, revealing a man in a tailored suit, his silver hair catching the last rays of the sun. He stepped down with an air of authority that made Ethan's stomach twist. Behind him, another man, younger, sharper, adjusting his cufflinks with a practiced ease, followed, his gaze scanning the area before landing squarely on Ethan. The older man turned, locking eyes with Ethan across the distance, and in that moment, Ethan felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths pressing down on him. He didn't know who they were, but he knew one thing for certain: they were here for him. The black car rolled toward the garage, its engine purring like a beast stalking its prey. Ethan's pulse quickened as the vehicle stopped just feet from where he stood, the door opening with a soft click. The younger man stepped out, his polished shoes a stark contrast to the oil-stained concrete. He offered a polite nod, his voice smooth as silk. "Ethan Brooks?" Ethan hesitated, his throat dry, the rag in his hand suddenly feeling like a lifeline. "Yeah, that's me," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled faintly, a smile that held no warmth. "My name is Daniel Harper. I represent Mr. Richard Sterling." He gestured toward the older man, who was now approaching with a measured stride, his piercing blue eyes studying Ethan like a man who had seen the world and bent it to his will. "We need to speak with you," Daniel said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Ethan's mind raced. Richard Sterling. The name hit him like a freight train, though he couldn't place why. He'd heard it before, whispers of a billionaire who owned half the tech industry, a man whose wealth could buy entire towns like Willow Creek without a second thought. But what could someone like that want with a small-town mechanic? Ethan glanced around, half expecting cameras to pop out, revealing this to be some elaborate prank. But there was nothing, just the hum of the jet's engines in the distance and the weight of Sterling's gaze. "Sure," Ethan said finally, clearing his throat. "What's this about?" Richard Sterling stepped forward, his presence commanding the space between them. His voice was deep, steady, like the rumble of thunder on a distant horizon. "2 days ago, you fixed a wheelchair for a little boy. You refused payment, worked late into the night, and gave him something most people wouldn't bother with, his freedom." Ethan's stomach tightened. He remembered the boy, Noah Carter, a quiet kid with big, hopeful eyes, his wheelchair a broken mess. Ethan had spent hours repairing it, using spare parts from an old bike frame, because the thought of that child being stuck, unable to move, had struck a chord deep within him. But how did Sterling know about that? Sterling's expression softened, but his eyes held a storm of emotions Ethan couldn't decipher, gratitude, perhaps, or something heavier. "That boy," Sterling continued, his voice steady but laced with something raw, "is my grandson." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The pieces slammed together with a force that left him reeling. The jet, the car, the billionaire standing in front of his struggling garage, it all made sense now. He had helped someone far more important than he'd realized, someone whose family could change the course of his life with a single word. But there was something else in Sterling's gaze, something that made Ethan's blood run cold. "I don't believe in debts, Ethan," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I believe in rewarding good people." Daniel stepped forward, producing a sleek black envelope from his coat. "We have an offer for you," he said, extending the envelope toward Ethan. "The kind that will change your life." Ethan stared at the envelope, his fingers twitching as if it might burn him. He had no idea what was inside, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him like a hydraulic press. He was just a mechanic, a man who fixed things, not a man who stood in the shadow of billionaires. His entire life had been about scraping by, about keeping his tiny garage afloat in a town that barely noticed him. And now, here he was, on the edge of something he couldn't comprehend. With a deep breath, he took the envelope, his hands trembling as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words blurring before his eyes as his brain struggled to process them. It was a contract, a business proposal, and at the bottom, a number so large it made his knees buckle. A salary that could buy his garage 10 times over, benefits he'd never dreamed of, a chance to design mobility equipment in a state-of-the-art facility. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. This can't be real." Sterling's expression remained unreadable. "It's very real, Ethan." Ethan's mind spun, a whirlwind of disbelief and fear and hope all colliding at once. He looked up at Sterling, searching for answers in the man's weathered face. "Why me?" he asked, his voice cracking. Sterling's eyes darkened with something Ethan couldn't place: respect, gratitude, or perhaps regret. "Because people like you are rare," Sterling said softly. "You didn't help Noah for money. You did it because it was the right thing to do. That kind of integrity, that kind of kindness, is worth more than any degree or resume." Ethan felt his chest tighten, the weight of those words sinking into him like a stone. He had never thought of himself as anything special. He was just a man who fixed things, a man who couldn't bear to see a child struggle. But now, standing in front of a billionaire who saw something in him that he'd never seen in himself, Ethan felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Sterling seemed to sense his hesitation, his voice softening further. "Take your time, Ethan. Think it over. But I'll need an answer soon." He turned, heading back toward the car, Daniel following close behind. The jet's engines hummed softly in the distance as the car pulled away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the fading light, the contract clutched in his trembling hands. He looked down at the paper, the numbers and words swimming before his eyes. His entire life had been about fixing things, cars, bikes, engines, but now, for the first time, he had the chance to fix something far bigger, his own future. But as the dust settled and the roar of the jet faded into the distance, a single question burned in his mind, a question that would unravel everything he thought he knew. How had a simple act of kindness, fixing a little boy's wheelchair, brought a billionaire to his doorstep? And what had happened in the days leading up to this moment to set such an unimaginable chain of events in motion? The hum of the jet had long faded into the horizon, leaving Ethan Brooks standing in the dim glow of his garage's flickering sign, the contract still trembling in his hands. The air felt heavier now, as if the weight of Richard Sterling's offer had settled into the cracks of the concrete floor, seeping into the very foundation of the life Ethan had built. He glanced at the paper one last time, the numbers glaring back at him like a promise, or a challenge. His mind was a storm, swirling with disbelief and questions he couldn't yet answer. But as he turned to lock up for the night, a memory flickered to life, pulling him back to a moment 2 days earlier, a moment that, unbeknownst to him, had set this entire chain of events in motion. 2 days ago, the sun had been just as low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement outside his garage. Ethan had been elbow-deep in the engine of an old pickup truck, his hands stained with grease, when he'd heard it, a soft, uneven creak, the kind of sound that didn't belong in the rhythm of his workday. He'd wiped his brow, stepping out into the fading light, and that's when he saw him, a little boy, no more than 8 years old, sitting in a wheelchair that looked like it had seen better days. The front wheel was twisted at an unnatural angle, the frame misaligned, the brake barely hanging on. The boy's small hands gripped the armrests, his face scrunched in frustration, tears glistening in his big, hazel eyes as he tried, and failed, to move forward. Beside the boy stood a woman, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, her hands clutching a worn-out purse as if it were her only anchor. She looked at her son with a helplessness that Ethan recognized all too well, the kind of helplessness that came from loving someone so much but having no way to fix their pain. Ethan had seen hardship before, had lived it himself, but something about the boy's quiet struggle struck him like a hammer to the chest. He stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the pavement, and knelt beside the child, his voice soft but steady. "Hey, buddy, looks like you ran into some trouble." The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, his voice small and trembling. "It broke," he said, sniffing as he glanced at his mother, as if unsure whether to continue. "I was just trying to go down the sidewalk, and it just," his words trailed off, swallowed by a quiet sob. Ethan turned to the woman, her face etched with worry, and offered a reassuring smile. "Let me take a look at it," he said, his tone firm but kind. "No charge." Her eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing her weary features. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have," Ethan held up a hand, cutting her off gently. "I insist." He lifted the wheelchair with care, rolling it into the garage as the boy watched from a stool nearby, his tear-streaked face now lit with a spark of curiosity. Ethan inspected the damage, his hands moving with the precision of a man who had spent his life solving problems others couldn't. The front wheel assembly was completely bent, the frame misaligned, the right brake barely functional. This wasn't a quick fix. It would take parts, labor, time, things Ethan couldn't afford to spare. His garage was already struggling, bills piling up like leaves in the fall, and work had been slow for months. But as he glanced at the boy, now sitting quietly, his small hands clutching a tattered stuffed bear, Ethan knew he couldn't walk away. None of the practical concerns mattered in that moment. All he saw was a child who deserved to move freely, to feel the wind on his face as he raced down the sidewalk like any other kid. Ethan worked late into the evening, the soft hum of his tools filling the garage as the world outside faded into darkness. He fabricated a replacement part from an old bicycle frame he'd kept in the back, his hands steady despite the ache in his shoulders. The boy's mother checked her phone repeatedly, her brow furrowed with worry, but Ethan reassured her with a quiet confidence. "This isn't just about fixing a wheelchair," he said, tightening the last bolt with a grunt. "It's about giving him the freedom to move again." When he finally rolled the wheelchair back out, the boy's gasp echoed through the quiet garage. Ethan hadn't just repaired it, he'd improved it. The wheels were stronger, the brakes functioned perfectly, and he'd even adjusted the seat for better comfort. The boy hesitated for a moment, his small hands hovering over the wheels, as if afraid to believe it was real. Then, with a tentative push, he moved forward, his face lighting up with pure, unfiltered joy as he glided effortlessly across the pavement. "It works," he shouted, his voice bright with wonder. "It's better than before." His mother's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she reached for Ethan's, squeezing them tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to us." Ethan only smiled, a tired but genuine smile that reached his eyes. "That's what mechanics do," he said simply. "We fix things." As they left, the boy's laughter echoing down the street, Ethan exhaled, a wave of satisfaction washing over him. He had done the right thing, even if it had cost him a day's work. But he had no idea that this simple act of kindness had set something far greater in motion, something that would bring a billionaire to his doorstep just 2 days later. Back in the present, Ethan leaned against the workbench, the contract still in his hand, his mind reeling as he pieced together the connection. The boy's mother, her name was Olivia Carter, he remembered now, must have told someone about what he'd done. But how had that story reached Richard Sterling, a man whose world was so far removed from Ethan's that they might as well have been on different planets? Ethan's gaze drifted to the corner of the garage, where the old bicycle frame still lay, a silent reminder of the moment that had changed everything. He thought of the boy's smile, the way his laughter had filled the air, and for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was capable of more than he'd ever believed. But the question still lingered, heavy and unanswered. What had happened in the days between that act of kindness and the arrival of the jet? What had Olivia Carter done, and who had she spoken to bring a man like Sterling into Ethan's life? As the night deepened, Ethan sat down on an old stool, the contract resting on the workbench beside him. He traced the edge of the paper with his thumb, his mind drifting back to Olivia's face, the gratitude in her eyes, the quiet strength in her voice. There had been something else there, too, something he hadn't noticed at the time. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or a secret she hadn't shared. Ethan's chest tightened as he realized that the answers to his questions lay not in the contract, but in the moments he had overlooked, the details he had dismissed. 2 days ago, he had fixed a wheelchair for a little boy named Noah Carter. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Noah's story, and Olivia's, held a truth far deeper than he could have imagined, a truth that would soon unravel the very foundation of everything he thought he understood about his own life. Ethan Brooks sat in the dim light of his garage, the contract from Richard Sterling resting on the workbench like a ticking time bomb. The night had grown colder, the air heavy with the scent of oil and the faint hum of crickets outside. His mind was a tangled mess, caught between the shock of the billionaire's offer and the memory of fixing Noah Carter's wheelchair 2 days ago. But as he traced the edges of the contract with his thumb, another memory surfaced, pulling him back further, a memory from earlier that day, before the jet had landed, before his world had tilted on its axis. It was a moment so small, so seemingly insignificant, that he hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now, as he sat in the stillness, that moment began to take on a new weight, a new meaning that sent a shiver down his spine. Earlier that morning, the sun had barely risen over Willow Creek, painting the town in soft hues of pink and gold. Ethan had been up since dawn, trying to distract himself with work after a sleepless night of wrestling with Sterling's offer. He'd been tightening bolts on an old sedan when he heard the familiar hum of an electric wheelchair approaching. He turned, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and there was Noah Carter, his small frame practically glowing with excitement as he maneuvered the repaired chair toward the garage with ease. Behind him, Olivia Carter followed, her face softer than it had been 2 days ago, a quiet smile playing on her lips as she watched her son. "It's perfect," Noah announced, his voice bright with joy as he rolled to a stop in front of Ethan. "It moves so smoothly now, and I barely have to push the controls." Ethan knelt beside him, inspecting the wheels with a practiced eye, making sure everything was still functioning as it should. "That's what I like to hear," he said, ruffling Noah's hair. "No issues at all?" Noah shook his head, his grin widening. "None. You're the best mechanic ever." Ethan chuckled, the warmth of the boy's words settling into his chest like a bomb. But as he stood, Olivia stepped closer, her expression shifting to something more serious, her voice lowering as she spoke. "I heard about the offer," she said, her words catching Ethan off guard. He tensed, the small-town grapevine working faster than he'd expected. News traveled like wildfire in Willow Creek, but he hadn't thought it would reach Olivia so soon. "Yeah," he said cautiously, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm still thinking it over." Olivia sighed, her eyes searching his with an intensity that made him uneasy. "Ethan, I know you love this garage. I know it's your life. But do you realize what this opportunity means? You could help so many people, kids like Noah, everywhere, struggling with mobility, needing someone with your skills." Ethan's heart squeezed as he looked at Noah, who was now rolling in small circles, his laughter filling the quiet morning air. He had never thought about his work that way, never considered that fixing one wheelchair could ripple out to touch more lives than he could imagine. Olivia's voice softened, but her words carried a weight that pressed against him. "You've spent your life helping others, Ethan, but this is your chance to do it in a way that truly changes lives." Before he could respond, Noah reached out, his small hand grabbing Ethan's with surprising strength. "If you go, will you still fix my chair if it ever breaks?" he asked, his hazel eyes wide with a mix of hope and worry. Ethan felt his throat tighten, the boy's innocence cutting through the storm in his mind. He nodded, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Of course, buddy. Always." Noah's face brightened, and he looked up at his mother with a determined nod. "Then I think you should go," he said, his voice small but certain. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision pressing harder than ever. He had been searching for an answer, and maybe, just maybe, it had found him in the form of a little boy's unwavering trust. Now, back in the present, Ethan's gaze drifted to the spot where Noah had sat that morning, the memory of the boy's words echoing in his mind. He stood, pacing the length of the garage, the contract still untouched on the workbench. His hands hovered over the paper, but he couldn't bring himself to sign it. The decision felt bigger than anything he had ever faced before. He had spent his life in this garage, pouring his heart into every repair, helping the people of Willow Creek with whatever they needed. Leaving it all behind felt like abandoning a part of himself, a part he wasn't sure he could let go of. But as he paced, the sound of gravel crunching under tires broke through his thoughts. He turned, his heart skipping a beat, just in time to see a sleek black car pull up outside the garage, the same car that had arrived with the jet earlier that day. The driver stepped out, a man in a crisp suit and dark sunglasses, his stride confident as he approached. Ethan recognized him instantly, Daniel Harper, Sterling's assistant. "Ethan," Daniel said, his voice smooth and measured as he extended a hand. "I hope you've had time to think things over." Ethan shook his hand, but hesitation gnawed at him. "I have," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "But I'm not sure I'm the right guy for this." Daniel studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable behind the sunglasses, before gesturing toward the car. "Take a ride with me," he said, his tone leaving little room for argument. "I want to show you something." Ethan frowned, curiosity battling with his unease, but he nodded, climbing into the passenger seat. The car pulled away from the garage, the town of Willow Creek fading into the distance as they drove toward the outskirts. Daniel remained silent, letting the scenery pass in quiet contemplation, until they turned onto a long, winding road leading to a massive facility. Ethan's eyes widened as he took in the size of the place, gleaming glass and steel, a stark contrast to the weathered wood and concrete of his garage. The car parked, and Daniel led him inside, where a group of engineers and mechanics worked on various mobility devices, wheelchairs, prosthetics, high-tech equipment designed to help people with disabilities. Ethan watched in awe as they tested different models, each one more advanced than the last. "This is what we do," Daniel said, his voice steady as he gestured to the bustling workspace. "And we need someone like you, someone who doesn't just fix things, but cares about the people using them. Your work with Noah showed us that. It's why we chose you." Ethan swallowed hard, his emotions swirling as he took in the sight before him. He had always believed his work mattered, but seeing this, seeing the lives being changed on a scale he'd never imagined, made everything feel bigger, more real. He turned to Daniel, his heart pounding. "What happens if I say yes?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile, the first hint of warmth Ethan had seen from him. "Then your life changes forever," he said simply. Ethan exhaled, staring at the facility, the people inside, the future that suddenly seemed so clear. For the first time since receiving the offer, he felt a spark of certainty ignite within him, a certainty that he was on the verge of something greater than he'd ever dreamed possible. But as he stood there, the weight of Noah's words and Olivia's plea still lingering in his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, a deeper truth waiting to be uncovered, a truth that would soon reveal itself in ways he could never have anticipated. Ethan Brooks stood at the entrance of the sleek, glass-walled facility, his hands resting on his hips as he took in the sight before him. The hum of activity inside was a stark contrast to the quiet of his garage in Willow Creek, Engineers moved with purpose, assembling custom wheelchairs and prosthetic limbs, their faces etched with the kind of passion Ethan had always felt but never seen on such a scale. The air was alive with the sound of drills and the soft murmur of collaboration, a symphony of creation that made his heart race in a way he hadn't expected. He turned the badge Daniel Harper had handed him over in his hands, the weight of it grounding him as he read his name etched in crisp, bold letters, Ethan Brooks, lead mobility designer. The decision had been made. He had said yes to Richard Sterling's offer, stepping into a world he had never imagined for himself, a world where his skills could change lives far beyond the small town he'd called home for years. But as he stood there, the memory of the past few days weighed heavily on him, pulling him back to the moments that had led him here, to the choices that had shaped this new path. Just hours ago, Ethan had been driving back from the facility with Daniel, the contract signed and tucked into the glove compartment of the sleek black car. The weight of his decision had settled into his bones, a mixture of fear and hope that made his hands tremble as he gripped the steering wheel. He had glanced at Daniel, his voice quiet but firm. "I need to see them," he had said, the words spilling out before he could second-guess himself. "Noah and Olivia. I need to tell them myself." Daniel had nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes, and without a word, he had turned the car toward Willow Creek, the familiar streets coming into view as the sun dipped low in the sky. Ethan's heart had pounded as they pulled up to the small, weathered apartment complex where Olivia and Noah lived, the paint peeling from the walls, the windows glowing with the soft light of a single lamp. He had stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel, and approached the door with a heaviness he couldn't shake. He had knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness, and when Olivia opened the door, her eyes had widened in surprise, a flicker of hope mingling with the exhaustion that still lingered on her face. "Ethan," she had said, her voice soft as she stepped aside to let him in. Noah had been sitting at a small table, a coloring book spread out before him, his wheelchair parked neatly beside him. The boy had looked up, his hazel eyes lighting up with recognition, and before Ethan could say a word, Noah had rolled toward him, his small arms wrapping around Ethan's legs in a hug that nearly brought him to his knees. "You came back," Noah had exclaimed, his voice muffled against Ethan's jeans. Ethan had knelt down, his hands resting on the boy's shoulders, a lump rising in his throat as he looked into those trusting eyes. "I told you I'd always fix your chair, didn't I?" he had said, his voice thick with emotion. Noah had nodded, his grin wide, but Olivia's gaze had been searching, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if bracing for what Ethan might say next. He had stood, meeting her eyes, and the words had poured out of him, raw and unfiltered. "I took the offer," he had said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "I'm leaving Willow Creek. But I needed to tell you, both of you, that this, all of this, it's because of Noah. Because of what you said, Olivia. You made me see that I could do more, be more, than I ever thought possible." Olivia's eyes had filled with tears, but she had smiled, a small, genuine smile that carried the weight of her gratitude and her hope. "I knew you'd make the right choice," she had whispered, her voice trembling. "You're going to change so many lives, Ethan. Just like you changed ours." Before Ethan could respond, Noah had tugged at his hand, his voice bright with excitement. "Will you still come visit us?" he had asked, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and worry. Ethan had knelt again, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder, his voice firm but gentle. "I'll always come back for you, Noah," he had said, the promise settling into his heart like a vow. "No matter where I go, you'll always have me." Noah had beamed, his small hand squeezing Ethan's, and in that moment, Ethan had felt the last of his doubts melt away. He had made the right choice, not just for himself, but for the countless others he could help, the lives he could touch, starting with the little boy who had unknowingly set this journey in motion. Now, standing at the entrance of the facility, Ethan felt the weight of that promise anchoring him to this new chapter of his life. He took a deep breath, letting the reality of it all sink in, and stepped inside, the badge clipped to his shirt a quiet reminder of the man he was becoming. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of learning and discovery. Ethan threw himself into the work, absorbing new techniques, experimenting with advanced technology, and helping to design better mobility solutions. He had never felt so challenged, yet so fulfilled. Every day, he met people whose lives had been transformed by the devices they were building. Children who could run again, adults who could reclaim their independence, families who could smile without the shadow of struggle hanging over them. And every day, he thought of Noah and Olivia, their faces a constant reminder of why he had said yes, why he had taken this leap into the unknown. One morning, as Ethan walked into the facility, his toolbox in hand, he noticed a familiar figure sitting in a brand new wheelchair near the testing area. His heart skipped a beat as he approached, his steps quickening with a mixture of disbelief and joy. It was Noah, his small frame dwarfed by the sleek, state-of-the-art chair, his hazel eyes lighting up as he spotted Ethan. Olivia stood beside him, her hands clasped in front of her, a tear glistening on her cheek as she watched her son. "I wanted to surprise you," she said, her voice thick with emotion as Ethan reached them. "They built this just for him. It's the best chair he's ever had, he can move so much easier now. And it's all because of you." Ethan knelt beside Noah, his hands running over the chair's smooth frame, marveling at the design. "How does it feel, buddy?" he asked, his voice soft. Noah's grin was brighter than the sun. "Like I can go anywhere," he said, his voice filled with wonder. Ethan felt his chest tighten, the weight of those words settling into him like a warm embrace. This was why he had said yes, this was why he had left everything behind. Olivia reached into her purse, pulling out a small envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to Ethan. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Noah and I wanted to do something for you." Ethan hesitated, his fingers brushing against the envelope before he opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, the words scrawled in Noah's careful, childish handwriting. Ethan read them slowly, his throat tightening with each line. "Thank you for fixing my old wheelchair, but more than that, thank you for believing in me. You didn't just fix something, you changed my life." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of those words washing over him like a tide. Then he smiled, ruffling Noah's hair as he looked into the boy's shining eyes. "No, buddy," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You changed mine." And as he stood there, surrounded by the hum of the facility, the laughter of a little boy, and the quiet gratitude of a mother who had given him the courage to dream bigger, Ethan knew that this moment, this connection, was the true reward for his kindness, a reward far greater than any contract could ever offer.